Hey everybody. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to finish out the media part of this section, and then we'll stop there and then we'll do the other parts of this lecture series. So let me go ahead and share my screen. All right. And so we're going to go into visibility now. I am not going to get into, well, I'll explain that here in just a minute. Down at the bottom, we do have a visible timeline. You can actually scroll into it, I believe. There you go. Where you can see kind of when things started happening when it comes to sexuality and queerness on television. So I think that that's kind of an important graphic as we're talking about this in relation to sexuality. We're going to talk about a couple of definitions real quick before we get into that. We're going to talk about structured absence is when the dominant group has the power to keep certain groups or certain images out of the media, or really control what images there are, right? So you're going to see specific kinds of stereotypes, and those stereotypes are going to reinforce that that one specific group might be dangerous, or one specific group might be immoral, or one specific group might be hyper fetishized, or what have you. And these specific types of things, again, fall into the second definition of controlling images, where they use a stereotype in media, meaning these images are major instrument of power as they work to make racism, sexism, heterosexism, and poverty appear normal or natural. So they're going to make these stereotypes seem like that's the norm, seem like that's a natural thing, that's inherent, that's something that all particular people that fall into this group are, as opposed to really getting into the more nuanced idea that no particular person is only one identity, and only one identity is going to act a specific way. That's not how that works. We all have our own histories and biographies that shape and manage how we walk through our own identities, how we walk through our own specific situations, and how we interact with others. So then you're going to also talk about racial fetishism, involves really fetishizing a race or an ethnic group by sexually objectifying their bodies based on stereotypes. And again, you're really going to look at this when we talk about the ways in which we hypersexualize female and male specific racial archetypes, and why those imageries become very harmful to humans as we move through kind of how we see them within the world outside of media that's more realistic. So we're going to get into that. I will tell you that when it came to, whoops, hold on, let's try that again. There we go. When we went into racial stereotypes, I did write down some of those racial stereotypes. I did not give imagery for that for a lot of reasons. One, because I don't want to perpetuate some of those ideologies, and two, I also put in links to YouTube videos that really break down these stereotypes in really meaningful ways. And so I think that they did a better job than I would, and in order to really take the time to do that, I would have had to do a video segment on each one of these different categories, and I really wanted to make sure that that got its own time. And so I added several videos to your site so that you could go through and really break down those separately. I'm not going to read these here for you, but I do want to hit on a couple of the highlights, a couple of the things that really, when we're talking about sexuality, seem to get consistently brought up. And you're going to see Black women, older women, are going to be more considered like the mammy, this idea that they're taking care of or caring for in a more caring role, even if it's in a funny role. So you look at I don't know, I could really go in with any of them. Any movie that has a Black older woman, you're going to see a lot of that caregiving role. When you look at some of the younger Black women, you're going to see a lot of sex symbols. You're going to see them portrayed in this very like exotic beauty way. You're going to see a lot of African dress, whether they are from an African area or whether they were completely US based, and the character has nothing to do with necessarily Africa, but they're going to be put in these eroticized versions of those African dress styles, and in ways that aren't necessarily coherent or congruent with the actual communities that are being represented symbolically through some of those clothings. For Black men, you're gonna see a lot of, they're gonna be the criminal, and or you're gonna see a lot of this hyper sexualization where they are almost that sexual threat in and of itself. So you're gonna see a lot of Black men being portrayed as the rapist, and or you're going to see them be portrayed as the bad guys in a lot of crime shows, and that's a pretty consistent theme. And again, that's part of the messaging that gets flipped on its head when we talk about Black Lives Matter movement, and or any movements that are trying to discuss the conversations about racism in America. When you consistently have these images of Black men or Black persons in general, it is very easy to discard their words, discard their voices, and discard the violence that's happening to them in real life when they're consistent, when you can objectify them in ways that make them seem criminal. Again, we're going to reinforce all of these categories are stereotypes. These are not actualities. No particular group are homogenous, and there's not a way to specifically say that they're going to act and or be a certain way. And so we need to really be careful about making sure that we understand that these are stereotypes, not how people are in actuality. That does not mean that that's not a possibility. It just means that it's not a probability when it is posed as kind of the natural or the norm in particular medias. So you're going to see a lot of sexual hypersexualization of any of the Latinx community. They're going to be seen as women, as trophy wives. You're going to see very sexually promiscuous. You're going to see the same in Latinos, or you're going to see again that idea of human trafficking or rapists when you come down to crime dramas. And so there's this kind of flip script depending on what particularly the audience is supposed to be gazed at. If they're supposed to be gazing at them in a sexual way, they're going to be seen as very sexually promiscuous. If they're supposed to be the criminal, then you're going to see this very overized sexualized men in ways that are uncontrollable or inhumane or what have you. You're going to see and similar themes when it comes to Asian women. You see more sexually promiscuous, but you see them in more actualized settings. So you're going to see this more in brothels or massage parlors, as opposed to seeing this and on the streets or just in general. In the characters, those characters are going to be sexually promiscuous, but sexually promiscuous more so in specific arenas, in specific settings. You're going to see Asian men as seeing a lot of the funny sidekick, but you're also going to see them as this model minority. So you're going to see a lot more ability for Asian men to be that businessman, to fit a lot of the model of social norms closer to some of the, more so than some of the other men of color. Arabic women, you're going to see them as completely oppressed. You're going to see them a lot as weak. You're going to see them a lot as victims of crimes or victims of sexual violence. And when you are seeing some of those stereotypes in media, for Arabic men, you're going to see them a lot as terrorists. You're going to see them as extremists. You're going to see them as scary, going to abduct women. Most of the themes for Arabic men come down to violence and or criminality. And that's a pretty consistent theme in our media, which is not at all representative of that particular group of people. Indigenous women, you're going to again see them as very sexually promiscuous, but you're also going to see them usually portrayed with less intelligence, uneducated. You're going to see them as very like floaty, kind of like nature loving, kind of akin to like hippie-esque type, but they're not going to be, or you're going to see them as very poor, underserved population. You're not going to see a lot of very positive, well-educated, like empowered Indigenous women in media. In the same way, Indigenous men, you're going to see a lot of primitive. They're going to be considered stupid. You're going to see a lot of drunk, a lot of funny sidekicks, those kinds of thing. Or you'll see this like wise elder kind of trope where you can go to them and talk and they're very knowledgeable, which is very interesting to see how that dynamic gets polarized. But again, I would recommend some of the videos that I have put on the thing to really dive into these particular groups and their stereotypes more thoroughly. So queer relationships in media, I think this is very interesting. You're going to have a lot of tropes. You do see a lot of tropes in the characters that are queer on media. You're going to see a lot of very pretty people, or you're going to see specifically in lesbian relationships, you're going to see bush femme, or you're going to see like both people having to fit the particular social norm for beauty. When you look at the L word class, none of them look like anything other than very femme, very pretty, very the male gaze could still look at them and be attracted to them. And there's a reason for that, right? Because queer media is still assumed to be media that is going to be consumed by non-queer people. And so it's still catered to non-queer people. When you see gay men, you're going to see a lot of very effeminate men, or you're going to see a lot of funny, very jokes. They're going to be the butt end of some of the jokes. They're going to be, they're going to have to be like, they're going to have to make up for the fact that they're not supposedly catering to that by being something else too. They're also going to have to be witty, or they're going to have to be funny, or they're going to have to be showing something. Now, there is a graphs on page 162, which I think is very accurate, displaying kind of the visibility of queer people within media over the course. And I don't think a lot's changed since this book has really come out. I did put on here some examples of some movies that broke boundaries, TV shows that broke boundaries, specific scenes in that, specific characters, things of that nature that broke boundaries within media. It is still good to have these representations, even if they're not all that we want them to be. Again, a reminder that you're still going to see mostly white. The TV representations tend to be a little better than the movie representations, because movies are still made for a mainstream audience, where TV has a niche type of audience portal. So you have the ability to make more meaningful stories with more meaningful characters and better character arcs. And you're also going to see, this is something that's super important too, you're going to see a lot of non-queer people playing queer characters, which is something that is super frustrating. And it's super frustrating because there are queer actresses and actors available to play these parts. And it's not to say that straight people can't play these parts in meaningful ways, but it's to say that it's also okay to give representation and give people the ability to make meaning out of their lives, their stories, in ways that someone who is not necessarily gone through any of those trials or tribulations may not be able to bring to those, bring forth in those stories. And so that's another topic that keeps being brought up. Again, there's a lot of queer relationships that are hung on this idea of straightness too, that are hung on to these straight relationships. The queer people end up being the best friends, or you see they are pining for straight people that they can't have, or you're seeing the relationships being temporary, and then one of the parties going back to that heteronormative relationship, which again is okay, but there's not consistent, meaningful depictions of positive queer interaction. And so that's something that definitely is part of the conversation as well when we talk about queerness in media. Again, I'm going to bring up Hippo, Shira, some of those representations that weren't necessarily there in other forms of media. But there is this growing change. And I think actually it's happening in more youthful things and more than it's happening in adult media. It's getting there, but it's not as good, I guess, as we'll say. But it is something to keep an eye on, because I think that as the generation that watched the Sira and the Kipos and the things of that nature are going to grow into this idea that that can be part of their media and it should be part of their media. And so catering to that generation's audiences is going to be a little different, which will likely change how media portrays queer people. So we'll see how that goes. Trans representation in the media. So again, I tried to do a wide range here, right? So you have people that are part of reality shows that are within media, which are problematic in and of itself. You have queer or trans individuals that play characters that are assigned with their assignment of their sex at birth. You have queer or trans characters that play trans characters. You have trans characters that play just female characters, so it's or male characters. So it's important to kind of think about that and think about how androgyny works in this as well. And you also have a lot of straight cis people playing trans characters, which can be really icky. I chose not to put a lot of that on there. So you have things like Tu Wong Fu. You have things like John, like what's his name? I can't remember. So Wesley Snipes is also in drag a lot. There's several of straight cis men that like to, or not like to, but end up cast in roles where they're wearing a lot of things. You also a lot of cross-dressing that goes on that are depicting something different. You have the entire Medea series, which if you ever listen to Tyler Perry talk about, is talking about a representation of another part of himself. He still uses he, him pronouns. However, Medea is very much a living embodiment of a part of himself and the way he feels about himself and his gender. So I don't take that as a misrepresentation of self. I just think that that's an art form and a way to express himself in ways that feel meaningful to him. I did not put it on here, however, because he doesn't identify as trans, and so that character is not identifying as trans. And so, but I do think it's an interesting thing to really kind of think about as we're watching those movies or understanding those. There are a lot of tropes when we talk about trans stories in the media. So you're going to get a lot of those before and afters, or those they were a boy and now they're a girl, which is not accurate representation of them. They were assigned boy, and they develop into or got to express themselves in ways that were more meaningful and more accurate. And so they were never one thing and then another. That's not really how that works. They were assigned one thing and are now accurately displaying themselves in the way that they would want to. And so that's, but there can be a lot of this making up or over glamorizing this idea of hyper feminization, hyper masculinization of trans folks in their before and after transitioning, or movies that deal with transition. So kind of bear in mind of that. You also have the marketing towards these kind of ideas. You have a lot of making fun of these ideas. You have how it's represented. So like you can have false information about trans individuals representative in those media things, who plays a trans character, and if those trans characters end up living fulfilling lives, if their characters are end up being the train wreck on the screen, if they end up being something that is not as positive of an image of trans persons. And you see a lot less trans men in media, so that's something to also pay attention to. But you're also going to see trans characters as criminals and as victims a lot in crime shows. There are a lot of victims in crime shows, and there's almost always a link to something promiscuous, something that's they got themselves into, or drugs or what have you. There's not a lot of very positive representations of trans persons, and a lot of very heartfelt good conversations about those. So that's things to look for in media, and things that we need to maybe get to there. Last thing I'm going to talk about is disability and sexuality within movies. It's damn near invisible. Like you're not going to see disabled people in a lot of sexuality based content. You can see them in movies, but not as much in sexuality. You're not going to see them sexualized in the same way. You're not going to see them. Um, they're just assumed kind of this asexual from disability, no matter what the disability is. Neurodivergent people are also not really allowed to explore or have or be valid in their sexuality. And that's something that's wrong with our media, right? You're also going to see disabled characters being played by not disabled people. So a prime example of this is Artie in Glee. He did not really live in a wheelchair, but yet played that role, when there are plenty of actors that do live in wheelchairs that could have played that role. There is also a vast problem with how we display mental health in the media. It gets very icky very fast. And we portray mental health as something that is irrelevant to or not connected to sexuality or not part of the conversation. And that's something that I think that media has to change how it's going to make the right impact or to make the right statements. I will say that there are very few, but there are a couple queer disabled stories. One of my favorite is a couple that's in a medical drama that is called Night Shift. All the trigger warnings, by the way. It deals with a lot of PTSD. The doctors are all military members that used to be in the military or saw live action. The queer couple on there, one of the partners ends up being in a bombing and ends up losing some limbs and deals with the process of that. And so that's, I think, one of the very few queer couples that also have disability and also like shape into how mental health impacts relationships, and disability can impact a relationship in meaningful ways. Again, there's a lot of drama too, so it's dramatized in ways that are interesting. I also want to talk about how there's multiple different kind of medias and how disability and sex intersect in not just movies and not just TV, but also in video games as well, and the video game plot lines. So what do disabled characters, what can and can't they do in video games? And you will see some blind characters, you will see some hearing impaired characters, you do see some that are impacted in physical ways, depending on what kind of video game you're playing. So just things to kind of think about as you, again, get into your media. And I think that is it for our media. So I'm going to get off here, and then we're going to get back in to do school and the workplace.